Hi, yes, Irene Scott, Interim Humanitarian Director at Internews. So this session is following on from the amazing session that we just had with Meg and her panel. We would really like your questions. So before I introduce my fantastic panel as well, I did want to encourage you, you don't have to wait until the end of the session to put in your 2 cents, to yell at us, to add suggestions, whatever is in your heart and your mind. Please feel free to contribute because we'd like this to be a discussion with everyone on the stage, in the room, and also for those of us that are joining online as well. So in this session, we are talking about how the fundamental aims and approaches of community engagement, communication, and accountability play out in some of the biggest challenges that we're facing in our time today. Climate change, of course, is forcing us all to change the way that we live and the way that we work. I'm sure we've all been keeping an eye on COP27 this week, where the point has been made very clear that while we all feel the impact of climate change, it's often those nations that contribute the least to global emissions that really feel the heaviest impact of the climate-related shocks. We also have the impacts of conflict are increasingly complex and displacing tens of millions of people worldwide and destabilising communities. And of course, education for young people is continually disrupted by all of the above, making it really challenging for young people to meet their full potential. So how do we ensure that communities, individuals, of course, as well, that make up communities are engaged and able to make informed decisions and make a real and genuine commitment to response design and holding actors accountable? So my panellists today, I have in the climate corner, I have Sara Speicher, who is the Deputy General Secretary of the World Association for Christian Communication. Speaking from the corner of conflict, which sounds very aggressive, we have David Locaccio, the Head of Accountability to Affected People at ICRC in Geneva. Thank you for joining me. And of course, online, coming from the perspective of education and child participation, we have Serena Zanella. I'm looking up at you, Serena, you can't see, but waving, hi, who is the Child Safeguarding and Accountability Specialist at the Global Education Cluster. So welcome, everyone. I did want to start with you, David. The communities that you're working with are often on the move. So the person you speak with in the morning, you ask their opinion, you ask what they need, or you engage with, might be in a completely different city, state, or country by that afternoon. So how do you ensure that you're having a continual engagement with these communities that are on the move?
Thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation. Nice to be here. So I think it's not as clear-cut and not as often that people are, really moving from one place to the other. But it's true that in some instances, people move not just within a country, but even across border. I mean, we have seen in the past 10 years, in particular, with the Syria conflict, but also in Africa with a lot of migration. Are very mobile. So that's where it is important to have really the let's say the communication between, for us, delegations, but also within the movement of the Red Cross, Red Crescent. If we think about the protecting family link and restoring family link network, making sure that we have the systems in place for communication to understand from the perspective of migrants, for example, what are their needs across the migration route. So for instance, in Mexico, there are really efforts to work really along the route of the migrants to see what are the risks they face, what are the needs they have along the routes, and how we can have a continuum across that route.
Sara, I'll go to you. Thank you. So we were talking earlier in the coffee break and throughout the last few days, and you said to me a few times that we don't use these terms AAP, we don't use CEA, we don't use all of these acronyms. Basically, we just get the job done, which sounds refreshing. Could you tell me a little bit about how, and I'm going to use one anyway, CEA, plays out in the kind of work that you do?
Thank you so much. First I should perhaps explain the World Association for Christian Communication, because that usually gives people the wrong impression of what we do. We are an organization that believes communication is a justice and a rights issue, and that to empower people to access their full communication rights is a gateway to other rights. So so first of all, we don't have to make an argument within our organization or within our network that we're dealing with communication and that we're empowering communication. So that whole level we can just skip, because we just want to enable people on the ground, those people who are most affected, to be the ones who can enable themselves to be heard, that they can get the information that they want, that they are really the actors. So, I was put down here as an expert on climate. I'm not an expert on climate, but we do communication rights and climate change because we believe that the local people are the ones who are most affected by the changing climate, and therefore their stories need to be added to the policy debate, not just as color. It's not just bringing Indigenous people in their nice robes and feathers and saying, look, they really are affected. They need their stories to be told and taken seriously, and also that their traditional knowledge is preserved and shared within their networks, and that we can learn from that. So, these are our networks. These are our members. These are our institutional members. They are project partners, networks, community media. So we try to be really totally locally based, to really listen to what's needed. So when we do projects, our projects most of our projects are like 10 to 20,000 euros in a year. Small, but they make a difference because it's totally owned, designed by the people themselves. And it is planned, it is budgeted, but we try to keep it as simple as possible.
And then, so how do you elevate those voices to make sure that the local solutions that you're working with the community on are then elevated to those national policy levels and used as a way perhaps to influence policy throughout? Because I think we all know climate change isn't a national issue. It has very little respect for borders. How do we make sure that those approaches are then elevated to those levels?
That's a great question. And what we try to do after we work with the local partners in their own solutions, for instance, on developing, raising the awareness and training journalists to really accurately reflect climate and environmental reporting and being able to share their stories. The next stage is we try to network those local communities and those journalists with a wider network or a wider campaign. So we try to, whether that's nationally or regionally, we try to expand that. And then we look for places in international processes where we can bring them so they can either present their work or be part of the decision-making table. I always get a little nervous about where they say we need to have people at the table. We need to have the people who are most affected at the table. Because yes, while that's important, it's not just their presence. It's whether you're actually listening to them, whether they understand the processes, whether you keep talking about all the jargon and the AAP and this is the process which they don't understand. But how do we accompany them? How do we learn from that? How do we start small but make it a bigger process and make all those connections?
You say the community doesn't understand, but I think also a lot of us as practitioners don't understand that at the best of times as well. Serena, coming to you, so young people are rarely given much input into aid design, but they make up obviously a really big portion of people impacted by crisis. What do you feel the barrier is there? Is it the perception that, the age-old idea that what could young people know? They've hardly had any life experience. What could they possibly contribute to this situation? Or are there other barriers that we're facing in really incorporating the needs and preferences and wants of young people?
Hi, Irene, and good afternoon, everyone. I don't know if you can see me. I can see you. So thanks for your question. I think it's relevant to start by clarifying that my role is at the global education cluster. So my perspective is that of a sectoral cluster. As such, my focus is on strengthening child participation in cluster coordination functions. And one of the way that as the global education cluster we are trying to do that is by promoting that at least at the level of consultation, children, which are the larger component of the affected population when it goes to the right to education, are at least consulted in key phases of the humanitarian program cycle. So, for example, we are working a lot as the global education cluster on allowing cluster members to consult with children during education needs assessment. This practice is improving. Number of children that have been consulted so far has been growing consistently in the past 2.5 years, but it is still a challenge. It has been a challenge when we first introduced this practice as an element of effective education cluster coordination. So there is an issue with perceived complexity of consulting with children. So whereas it is true that we need to be expert in child participation and ensure proper safeguarding, child safeguarding and PSCA systems and protocols are in place to facilitate safe and meaningful participation, it's also very important, in my opinion, that we do start implementing child participation, and the more we do it, the more I think we become used to do it as humanitarian workers. So there is still a myth to debunk out there that child participation is a super complex function to implement. And definitely, I think there is still a limited appreciation of the value of children's opinion when it goes to their needs, their priorities, the way the crises have affected their well-being, their life. So in my case, it's a lot about the right to education. I was just discussing with a colleague that in a country where we are conducting an education and child protection needs assessment, children have mentioned in large proportions child marriage as a main barrier to girls' education. On the same question, adults haven't mentioned child marriage. So I think it's very interesting to learn that what children say is bringing more information, more clarity to our ability to understand the context and how crisis and context are impacting children's needs and priorities.
And you mentioned there, education assessments that you have with young people, and I think you're right. There's a real fear sometimes of interacting with young people and not doing it right. And I don't know how to talk to young people either, so I can understand from an element. But I think in a crisis, young people definitely have expectations that go far beyond the need for education. They have opinions on lots of things, and they have a need for lots of things. Obviously, as you said, their expectations around mental health, socialization, more than just learning their times table. But how do we move beyond consulting them around their education and child protection issues to actively incorporating their ideas and their needs and wants into the wider response? So if we're talking about shelter, what do young people think about shelter or how cash mechanisms work? How do we broaden their impact in the way that responses are designed?
Yeah, my opinion from a sectoral cluster perspective. So as mentioned, my focus is on education, and elements of child protection also appear as part of as elements of the right to education. But I would say as the global education cluster, I think that our role would also be to promote child participation as an implementable, feasible, important function that can be integrated in cluster coordination, in other cluster coordination functions, so that more and more other clusters, other sectors also consider consulting directly with children or young people within their areas of expertise. So hopefully, as the global education cluster, we can, give the example of how relevant and useful it is to be consulting with children, and that other clusters could do the same and bring all this at the intercluster coordination level, so that more holistic responses can be provided by the different thematic clusters or sectoral clusters. So I would say that child participation as an element of accountability to affected population could really become a practice within any sector coordinated through a cluster system.
Maybe bringing this back to the conflict scenarios, thinking of what we've just heard there from Serena, what would you need to make it easier for, I guess, a higher level of child participation and engagement in the kind of contexts where you're working? What are the barriers and perhaps the opportunities we have there?
So I would agree that in terms of child participation, sometimes we kind of say, oh no, I don't want to touch that. It's too sensitive. It's all about also how you work with the community to do that. And of course, you need to have, not going to take children on the side and talk to them without the community or their parents being involved. But if you explain, again, it goes back to information and dialogue. Explain, what is the purpose and how you're going to facilitate that, then it becomes easier for that to take place. And then you also, I think that the whole concept about diversity inclusion is that if you want to have actionable information, data, insights, you need to be able to do it in a way that is going to help you go beyond accountability to affected people as a monolithic group, understanding behind the people who are those people, based on age, based on sex, based on gender, based on disability. And the more you have the detailed or granular information, the more actionable the data will be, precisely as was mentioned. For example, for children, child marriage is an issue, not for adults. And you will have the same thing depending on whether you talk to persons with disability or women with disability or young persons. And that is really the value that you get then into being able to act on it.
Is that where we come unstuck? That we do, I feel like in a lot of these discussions, we do talk about accountability to affect populations. We're talking about engaging with the community and having this kind of homogenous approach to what is a group of people who are made up of individuals with very different needs and different wants, who might associate themselves or identify with many communities. There's a real intersectionality, obviously, in each person. Is that where I think we sometimes come unstuck with some of our community engagement interventions, is trying to understand what the community wants rather than what this selection of individuals wants or needs?
It's probably the case. I think the importance of going beyond just the monolithic group is important for a number of reasons. One, because if you just look at the majority and you don't go beyond, you might just replicate the existing discrimination and marginalization in the society because it's a majority. You may have people you don't see, you don't talk to. So that's one point. And the other point is that often in conflict, disaster settings, you also have limited resources. So you also need to prioritize what is being provided based on needs and the most pressing needs. Because in some situations, you have, let's say you have a conflict, you have persons displaced, but who have, they are affected by the conflict, but they have their own means to face the situation, while others may not. So it's also a matter of understanding in the spirit of partiality as well, who is most in needs and where do you bring the most added value rather than just trying to have blanket distribution without this understanding of different needs and diversity.
And I think we've spoken a lot as well at the conference so far about, the need for obviously for us to communicate and engage well, and that there are consequences if we don't do a good job, especially in the environments where you work, in environments of conflict. The consequences are very severe if we don't do a good job. Insecurity for the community, but also for your teams. Does that force you to get it right every time, or does it push you to own up to mistakes a little bit faster?
Sorry, you cannot do it perfectly all the time. But if you're honest enough, acknowledge the limitations and the mistakes you've made, I think you're on a better footing than if you're trying to bury it and just kind of let maybe people ignore it. So definitely being transparent, I feel, is added value. And as I think we spoke about earlier, just not projecting our own insecurities of, oh, how will people react if we, raise expectations or tell them that we're not able to do this or that. I think we're kind of downplaying the ability of people in conflict situations to understand what are possible limitations to what we can do. And usually people understand much better, and you're better off communicating clearly and honestly rather than either avoiding having the conversation altogether or letting people think that maybe something will be possible when actually it's not.
Sara, I think that's probably a good segue to hand over to you, because surely in the discussions that you're having and the engagement with communities around climate issues, there are some things that can be solved locally, and then there are really, really big things that you may have absolutely no impact on. So how do you draw that line or walk that fine line between what we can respond to as a community and have a community to listen to, and what is bigger than us?
Unfortunately, we see a lot of things that are bigger than us. And I think part of it is to understand where we could make a difference. And if we can make the difference in a community and their access to their own solutions, that they feel that they are more capable to seek out the solutions and to access some other rights, whether that's education, whether that's equipment, whether that's participation, then we try to set up realistic goals. And I think one of our main goals is ownership, so that even if it's a small project, that those communities own that solution, and it lasts long after our funding is gone. So it's a key part of our sustainability is to make sure that, and our approach to sustainability, which is related to the climate, is to make sure that the communities say, yes, okay, this is our needs. Actually, we're empowered to start doing that need, and we can see moving that forward.
Let me turn to you, Serena. I'm looking up at you again. When you're working with young people, and I don't know how to say this without sounding really quite uncool and old, but young people are really quick adopters to new technology. They love TikTok. They're often more flexible to change. I try and think back of when I was a young person, and I was much more open to new ideas, maybe more creative. Is one of the challenges that some of the solutions that young people bring to the table for some of these problems? Do you think the aid industry may be resistant because there's a concern that our aging minds and inflexibility can't respond to these really big ideas and enthusiasm that might come from young people? Are we worried we can't match up to their ideas, basically?
Yeah, well, the experience that I've had so far in child consultations in the context where education clusters are active and operate is really not high technology. So, for example, we are promoting an approach to child participation that is very much based on focus group discussion, that is direct interactions with the children. We had some limitations during COVID, but technology so far hasn't played a big part in the way that we engage with children. And also the focus of our consultations with children for being very much about barriers to the right to education, child protection issues that may occur in educational settings, is bringing out so far information that is reiterating issues that have been there, such as child marriage, for example, or need to look for jobs for some children and young people who need to drop out from school, that do not seem to be surprising or very innovative. So in this sense, the kind of interactions that we have as the education cluster with children has not yielded, I think, results outside of the realm of education and emergency responses that we can handle normally. But as my colleagues say, not everything that is mentioned during consultations with children can be transformed into a response later on. But I would say that so far we haven't come across ideas that are particularly innovative, which, however, I think also speaks to the fact that there is a lot that we can do to meet the needs of children and try to fill the gap of what they perceive are their needs. Sometimes are basic needs, because it's so blatant how lack of education is the big issue in some context.
And I wanted to put it out to the audience and remind everyone who's doing a very good job, well done, in your post-afternoon sugar slump. There's a microphone out there, and I'd love to encourage questions from the audience. Oh, I can see Rosie has her hand up. I may have slipped her some money earlier on, but I would love to hear your question from the floor.
This is a question I genuinely want to ask. It's not to help you out. I guess I am struck a little bit, Sara, by the way that you're thinking about the voice of communities within global discussions about who is responsible for climate change and who is going to be held to account for that. And the way you describe that is a long-term process, right? I guess I want to hear from the panel, anyone on the panel who'd like to answer this question, is sort of how do we move away from CCEA as a tool that might ensure that responses are more responsive, or that people are getting what they need in the moment, and towards a transformational process. And if we can think about it as a kind of transformational process, what does that transformation look like in 5 years or 10 years? If we're really serious about this area of work, where does it take us in the longer term? And this is maybe an unfair question to ask, because it's one that we're here to try and answer together, but just to try and move away from the idea of it as a tool and a sort of tactic, and more a process that is, transformational. Any thoughts on that?
I can start, but I'm certainly looking for other input. Partly I look at how can we start. Well, we often think of large scale, like climate, as a large scale crisis, so it needs large scale solutions, and we often envision, okay, this is the solution that we need to implement at the local level. And part of the transformational thinking is, what if we start at the small scale and the smallest scale and build that up to the larger scale, so that we really are saying, we're listening to the communities, we are present at their table, and we network, we build on their needs, help them take ownership, link them to the next community and the next community and the next community. because I think that can be transformational in the end. It is a long term, but in the end, it's far more sustainable than trying to say, well, we have a solution. Yes, you can put that in your own language, perhaps, but it's not something that they really own or that they feel really meets their needs.
I like what you said there about going to their table instead of bringing them to our table, which is quite often what I feel that we're doing. David, to put you on the spot, did you want to add to that question from Rosie?
Yes, no, we could do like probably a full day on that. But just to say first, on the language, I think for me also, I'm like Meg. I was a bit uncomfortable with the whole framing of the discussion, because for me, there is no importance on the language we use. For me, it's like a home. You can call that a home, a mansion, a chalet, a castle. Still kind of a building with doors, windows, floors. And what I'm interested in is the components that make that a house with a purpose. So for me, what is important is what is the purpose of doing all of this? And for ICRC, it's very clear. It's one, an ethical responsibility to put people at the center, because in the end, this is what we have as a mandate to display humanity, impartiality, and the only way to do it is putting people at the center. And connected to that, as kind of almost a consequence, but also part of the quality aspect, making a response that is more relevant, effective, timely, etc. So, and then going from there, you try to build your strategy. And for us, we have adopted a theory of change that is trying to be really systemic and with a system thinking in terms of what we want to do, and from the problem statement of what is today posing obstacles in terms of maybe absence of clarity on standards, absence of buy-in, the fact that we have different ways of doing this in the house inconsistently, that we also have maybe some instances still a lack of accountability for putting things in motion. I think that AAP should be a bottom-up process when it's about the programs and the work with communities. Sometimes it should also be a top-down process in terms of enforcing the commitments we make as organizations and holding people to account by making public, internally at least, what are the commitments, what have people done, where are the gaps, and not just like letting things slip. So I think it's a whole process. It's also about having the systems in place. What are the incentives? We see also in the ICRC, we have the tension between, implementation rate, how much money you spend within the planning cycle, and this is pushing people to spend the money. And the more you talk to people and you try to be collaborative, work with other organizations, the longer it takes and the less you're likely to hit those targets. So how do we, put the cursor in the right position to have impact? Use the money, but there is definitely, in my view, a contradiction between a growth mindset financially and putting AAP into practice. So do we want impact or do we want growth? And here we need to also be honest about sometimes the incompatibility of the two.
And honest, I think, about our intentions, right? When we go to the community, are we approaching the community with the intention to, multiple times tick a box, to gather their feedback so we can fill in a report, to engage so that we said we engaged, or is our intention purely to sit and listen and just see what happens? To actually come a little bit clearer of intention rather than trying to, spend money or fulfill the goals that we have rather than the goals that, say, the community has. Serena, I wanted to be conscious of you that you're sitting up there on the screen above me. Did you want to add to Rosie's point?
Well, I think Rosie touched upon a very interesting point, that is the fact that sometimes I think we see communication with communities, in my case, child participation, or even accountability to affected population within the humanitarian system as tools or strategies rather than so means to an end rather than the end. I think in my case, in promoting child participation within education cluster coordination, I think that what helps or is helping is to show to the involved cluster coordinators the relevance of child participation for their job, the usefulness of knowing what children think about the education response, so that it becomes for them, for the cluster coordinators, a pleasure to including elements of child participation in their jobs. So now that I'm working a lot on facilitating child participation in education needs assessments, I've come across countries where they repeated the education needs assessment a couple of years later, and they did want child participation to be there. So I see that the more we practice child participation within the education cluster, the more education cluster coordinators want to do more work on child participation. So again, hopefully we are slowly shifting from seeing child participation as a tool, from moving into valuing children's inputs as ways to inform more accountable education responses within the sector.
Are there organisations that are doing child participation really well? Because I think we could probably all agree that you can't run a survey in the same way with adults that you would with children and hope to get, a valuable or useful result, or for anyone to have any fun. But are there organisations that are using really creative and innovative or just really interesting ways that have managed to engage with young people, whether they be children or, teenagers or whatever people's concept of young people is, because I know it's quite broad in many different contexts. But who is doing a good job, and what are they doing? What could we all be doing, basically?
Yeah, again, I visibility only on the education sector. Well, firstly, let me say that it's interesting to note how child-focused organizations sometimes do not necessarily champion child participation. So even the fact that you're a child-focused organization might not equate necessarily that children's participation is systematically facilitated and integrated in your programming. Then going back to the education actors within clusters, I've come across a number of NGOs in different countries that do implement child participation as part of their education programming. There's plenty of guidance out there on child participation. So Save the Children, Plan International. I spoke with Terre des Hommes the other day. They are not necessarily working in the education sector in many countries, but we exchanged on their current ongoing program on better integrating child participation in their child safeguarding work. Local NGOs sometimes might have, much more direct engagement with children in their programs, and good practices. Then there are a number of initiatives currently ongoing on youth engagement from UNICEF, NRC. COVID under 19, for example, that was led by a number of organizations. So there is quite an active scenario on child participation and youth engagement. I would say particularly in the past 3 or 4 years, this topic has peaked momentum.
Maybe I'll put the question. We have a question from the floor, actually. Please go ahead.
Not a question, but just to comment around the question you raised around. Recently, we were involved around the user-centric design on designing technologies, and the question of young people comes quite often. And it's an interesting one, because we come across very UN-centric style of programming, and that was the first time. So, a couple of things. It sounds no-brainer. For example, we always push our engineers to go and find that 13 or 14 years old boy or girl and just ask them, how is it going in a camp? They're the most politically incorrect. They don't see aid as aid. You just start asking them what time you wake up and how does it go till evening. It's amazing. That's the open-ended sort of conversation to have, and gets all the challenges, all the access issues, all the protection issues, all the communication issues, all the power dynamics comes flat on your face. Another big, coolest thing, which on technology part we found, and this is my biggest trouble, and I don't know what to call that advocacy, we as humanitarian things after 6 o'clock till 8 in the morning, people disappear. Because we disappear from those places as humanitarians, so we think nobody exists and they don't have a life and they don't have any assistance to aid. And what do? God damn it, it's a long time, right? And asking a 14 or 15 years old boy or girl, what do you do whole night? It's tons of protection issues. It's tons of power dynamics, all that leisure and entertainment. And I'm missing Stain here because we are a big advocate of let people have entertainment. That's social cycle support. I mean, they need to have that. What's a big deal about it? Just to reflect around, I mean, these people are wealth of knowledge. When we are talking all about listening, these are the people to go to, just to reflect around.
No, I think that's a really great point that, as we've heard, there are lots of methodologies we can use and guidelines, but you can also just go and have a chat with someone. Maybe it can be that simple, human to human.
Thanks. I come from a background where I've always believed that some of the major changes in humanitarian assistance have been generated through field practice. That's kind of my personal observation. I think it's more than the personal observation, but I've seen it, and I just wanted to give one. The only example I can think of, which is a shocking one, well, shocking, no, but it certainly reveals my age, if nothing else, was a long debate around distributing seeds and tools as humanitarian assistance. And the debate inside the organisation that I worked for was, this was not humanitarian assistance. It could not be done, but it was very clearly what was needed because it's what the people who were receiving the food were telling us. Thanks for the food, but can you please give us seeds and tools? Anyway, I have a question for the panel, if anyone wishes to kind of address it or can help address it, because I'm just curious at a very practical level. If we're looking at climate and education, which are more recent engagements in the humanitarian sector, conflict obviously has been around far too long. But I'm wondering if the panel, and meanwhile, communication and community engagement and accountability have all risen to the fore, I don't know, in the last decade, maybe. I mean, as formal processes within our sector, which kind of would lead us to believe that, okay, this, not only is it important, but it probably had a huge impact or a significant impact. And my question to anyone in the panel is if they can share specific examples of where communication and community engagement in recent years and those themes have kind of opened our eyes to kind of just different ways of doing things or different programs or substantive changes. Thanks a lot.
And I will go into the Christian network here in terms of a large scale, the stories that came from our Pacific churches and communities. And so they emphasized true storytelling from their communities about the very real impacts of climate change, which when it gets communicated then to some of our bigger funders and donors, Christian agencies, they realized we will redirect, we will carry this into international fora, and we will redirect some of our work to go to the Pacific Islands and to assist in that area. So we've seen a kind of programmatic change in that area because of the storytelling, and that they were persistent, and they were persistent, and they were persistent.
Serena, let me hand it over to you online.
Yes, hi. I think it's Jeff who spoke before. So what I wanted to say, what the work that we are doing at the Global Education Cluster on child participation, I think it is quite of an innovation, meaning that as a cluster and as a global cluster, we are uniquely positioned in this effort of consulting with children. So we aren't achieving major breakthroughs, but definitely more and more children are being at least consulted by education cluster actors. Some of the things they tell us are being used to influence the education response within the cluster coordination system. So here I think the good practice is the process in itself, that as a cluster, which is a coordination body not in charge of implementing and delivering education responses, we are introducing a level of accountability in our ways of working through, in this specific case, child participation, which I think is a result of all the reflections that you've mentioned in terms of, in the past about 10 years, improving our level and systematizing our level of accountability, and giving education, hopefully, the right place within the humanitarian system. Now I think that we are improving on consulting children during key stages of the humanitarian program cycle. I think as a cluster or as a sector, we should be better able in responding and meeting those needs, or as it was mentioned before, even going back to children and say what we cannot do as a cluster or as a sector. So I think we are still it's still work in progress, but at least we are off to a good start because we have started the consultation process.
Thank you. David?
Yes. So from my side, I would say I don't think the sector is particularly good at innovation and doing so at scale. You can have some good ideas here and there at individual level, but it's tied to a project and then it stops and bye. And probably I find it a bit illustrative of that, the fact that we consider the inclusion of cash as a kind of a method of doing humanitarian action as the best thing we've done since sliced bread. When if you were talking to anyone outside of the sector, they would be like, really? You just discovered cash? So that it could be used for people, it could be, so just not to make fun, but it just like shows a bit where we are. So Geoff is probably well placed to know also that access to education, is something that has been also very instrumental at the ICRC to move forward as something we do that we don't feel comfortable because is it in the mandate, and even though people request that. So there is, of course, needs that we hear about, that we can act, but it's not easy. And often I find that it's the influence of external discussions that push us to do something. Climate, yes, we start doing something, but also because that's the big conversation in town, and you can't escape it. Of course, we see it as ICRC as also a driver of conflict in places where we are, but the ability of the sector to anticipate those discussions and start moving it before it's pushed to us still to be improved.
I mean, I would agree. I agree with you on your arguments around cash, that us talking about it being a revolutionary way to give people cash and they'll buy what they need and be happier is, I agree. I do roll my eyes a little bit sometimes. I'm glad that we've come to the table. Welfare systems have been doing this for a very long time before we did. I think it can be difficult in these kinds of conferences though as well. I think we're all very good at highlighting what we're not doing or where we're falling short or where we're trying but failing. And it's hard not to fall into that mindset of a whinge fest. But I would say in the last 10 years, we have made a lot of great changes in the work that we're doing. No, we're not perfect. One example I would give, even though I'm not a panelist, I'm just going to take the opportunity of having a microphone. But one example I would give is, a lot of the work that Internews does around rumours and misinformation in humanitarian contexts. 10 years ago, if someone said, hey, there's a rumour of whatever, or someone's asking a question, but they're using information that isn't quite right. It's a little bit, it's unverified. 10 years ago, humanitarian responders would say, oh, we don't have to respond to that. That's a rumor. That's irrelevant to us because they're not really asking a question about something that we know about or something that's real. So we can ignore it. And I think, if anything, we've seen now with the COVID crisis over the last few years, it has been very exciting to see how many rumour tracking projects are happening. They're everywhere now. I feel like you sneeze and another rumour tracking project, springs up in a corner. And that doesn't mean, again, that we're all doing it really well. We're all really learning and trying to get better. But I think that in itself is illustrative that I think we're starting to understand a little bit more how information plays a role in the environments where we're working and why bad information can have a real impact on the way that we do our work, pose a security risk, and also just make life hard. So thank you for your question. While I pause for the audience to think of another brilliant question to spur on this conversation, I did want to talk to the panel a little bit about trust, because we've talked a lot over the last couple of days around the importance of community participation and engaging with communities, and all of this is very difficult without trust. We heard earlier in the day that trust is built over time. It's built over cups of tea and sitting and listening and, building those relationships, things that can be very difficult in a humanitarian crisis, of course, when we're all running around like headless chooks. I wanted to ask the panel around your, relationship with trust in the programs that you're doing, and how you, I won't use the word ensure because as we know that's been banned, but how you understand whether your community trusts you. How do you test or understand whether there is trust? And of course, how important is trust to the work that you're doing and the success of the work that you're doing? Do you need 100% trust to make your work? Sure. Sara, you're our number one at the moment, so jump on in.
Move from left to right. First of all, yes, I think that trust doesn't come necessarily in a crisis. So this is why trust is so important in development work, and to look at it as a long-term process, that you're developing a relationship. So even if you are a humanitarian actor, and I have to say that WACC is not, we don't work in humanitarian crisis, so we work in sustainable development. But we feel that builds a resilience so that if there is a crisis, communities are more equipped to respond, and therefore we have built trust. And I would believe that a community would only trust us if they know we trust them. And so that comes first. So we have to ask ourselves, do we trust them to use and to carry out the project, to develop the response that they have outlined, and that we have a goal? And I suppose we know that if they tell us, A, something didn't go to plan, that they're honest with us, and they know that we're not going to say, well, then you're not going to get any future funds or anything like that. They just know, okay, so what's the reality now, and we'll move on. It's a very direct conversation that we have. And the other is because they keep in contact. So we keep the conversation going, even after the funding, because they're intrigued, they see the solution, they see they're part of it, and they want to keep the conversation going. And that to me is also an element of trust.
David, I'll hand it over to you. Communities might rely on us for aid quite often, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they trust us. They might really need us, but they might not trust us. So in your environment, how do you know that the community trusts you?
So I think first you need to be clear about what is the concept of trust and concretely what it turns into. And there is one a trust equation I like because it kind of breaks it down into a few components. One is the credibility. People trust you because you're competent or you appear to be competent at least. They trust you also, you add to that reliability. Do you actually do what you say you're going to do? Are you reliable? Trust as well. And third, empathy. So how do you behave with people? And this is also an element that supports trust. And then in the equation, you divide that by the agenda. Why do you do what you do? Is it because there is an agenda behind, or is it because you're just driven by humanity, impartiality, and people can trust that you don't have something in the back of your mind? So then, when you have that, you know what to do in order to develop and maintain the trust, which is of course something that takes place over time. You don't just trust a stranger right away. In particular, in conflict situations, want to see what is the history, where are people coming from. In detention, for example, you go visit detainees. They have never seen you. They may not have heard about ICRC. First, they want to see, okay, I'm sharing something very personal, very risky potentially. Can I trust this person? So is the person coming back? Is what I say, does it remain confidential? Does it make a difference? So it's all this process that is important at a kind of personal level. So proximity is key here. Then you can add other tools to assess perception surveys. Do people trust us? But I think the personal relationship, the proximity is as much key in that as the more elaborate surveys with ground truths that you could have.
Surveys is an interesting point, and not pointing to ground truth at all. I often see in quite a lot of surveys with communities in humanitarian contexts the question, do you trust humanitarians? And I wonder whether, and I am coming to you, Serena, don't worry, I wonder whether that question really encapsulates the complexity of trust. Trust is, as you said, highly influenced by proximity. It's highly contextual as well. Trust, you cannot just say, oh, I trust you entirely for absolutely everything. I might trust my doctor to perform surgery on me or to prescribe the right medication. I might not trust them to cut my hair. I might not trust them to advise me, what to wear out on a Friday night. It's very contextual. And coming to you, Serena, for young people as well, I think I wonder how we understand their trust relationship with us and the system and the wider education and child protection interventions that they're interacting with. Can you just ask young people, do you trust me?
Well, this is the difficult question for me to address because as the educational cluster, we are faced with a degree of separation from actual project participants or affected population because we are coordinating organizations that deliver educational assistance. So they are directly in touch with children and young people and adults in education responses. In general, however, my experience from the cluster perspective is that in the education sector, children or young people who are the end users of the educational services that is being designed and delivered are hardly even involved in conversations around education. So I go back to your first question, I think, in this panel. That is the fact that probably we as the humanitarian sector don't value much the opinion of children and young people. So in that sense, we, I think, are not trusting the children and young participants to our project. So I don't know how much or how far we can expect them to trust than the humanitarian system. But to answer your question on, can we go out there and ask children and young people, do you trust us, or many other direct questions? As someone from the audience said before, you can ask a lot of questions to children and young people. You will have quite honest answers back. So I think children are very good participants in conversations because rarely they would have an agenda. So if you want to know, if you want to have a honest conversation, I think children sometimes are more revealing than adults on whatever question you have.
We could maybe get a lot more done if we ask more questions to young people rather than than the adults.
Yeah.
I did want to mention, so we're about 5 minutes away from the end of this session. I'm keeping an eye on the clock as instructed. So I as a continuation, I guess, of the session that we had before our coffee break, and the question of, if you had a magic wand that could fix everything, what is the one thing that you would do, or perhaps the one lesson from community engagement and communication in your context that you wish the wider sector understood and also implemented? Sara, sorry to put you on the spot, because I can see you already groaning at my question, but what is the one thing we can learn, or what is the one barrier that your magic wand would fix?
I think the more we put in the authentic voice of the community in our responses and our learning. So it's not just reporting about, it's not just, I mean, collecting data is important, collecting reports, finding the evidence and acting on it. But the more we really ensure the communities can say the things for themselves and that we hear them as a principle and a practice, then I think that can be part of the transformation.
David?
So magic wand, I think actually the solution is within. We kind of seem to struggle a lot, but to a large extent, the reason why we're not doing what we say we want to do is all the obstacles we put for ourselves collectively as a sector, between donors, agencies, staff. And if we could just like take not the magic wand, but just boom, and faire le ménage to remove all the obstacles that prevent us from putting things in action with policies, procedures, etc. I think we quite a bit.
I agree with you on that one. Serena, do you have a magic wand or a broom that you'd like to apply?
Yeah, my dream is for more and more children to be consulted in humanitarian responses, not only by the education cluster, but by all possible clusters. So here the message that I would like that comes across is that safe and meaningful child participation can be done. So I think, it's important to be careful and go professionally into child participation, but it can be done, and it's not for only experts. So every humanitarian worker, in my opinion, can do implement child participation in their daily work.
Thank you. And I wanted to give a really big thank you to our amazing panel. I'm putting up with my badgering for the last hour. Thank you very much for your responses.